Hey everybody. This is one part of a two-part series on interesting ways to highlight embossed paper. Today I'm starting with a 5x7 sheet of cold press watercolor paper, and I've embossed it with this beautiful 3D embossing folder. So there's a little bit that's not embossed because my watercolor paper is slightly larger. And I've prepped it with a powder tool, and I'm using my brayer and this brilliant white ink pad to begin the highlighting process. Now, when you're doing this, you'll want to have very light pressure. Don't press on the brayer at all. Just let the weight of the brayer on the paper be the only pressure that you put on that paper, and that will keep the white ink highlights very up high on this 3D folder. It's only going to hit the highest points, which is what I want for this technique. Now you can add either clear or white embossing powder to this and give it a good thump on the back to get off any excess, and then put your spare embossing powder back in the container so that you don't emboss your entire workspace. Now, if you get any little extra bits of embossing powder, if you were not judicious enough with your powder tool, then just use a soft paintbrush to remove those. This actually didn't end up mattering because this is most of where I had the extra powder was beyond the embossed part, but I can't resist cleaning up stray embossing powder, so I just did it. Okay, now heat set that completely, and you can see the little shiny parts where the highest parts of this design have been hit with that embossing powder. Now spray the back and front of your watercolor paper with water. Spraying the back keeps it from curving, which will be very important because we're going to be painting on this for quite a while. The first thing I'm doing is dropping some liquid watercolor into the center of these flowers. Now the centers are one of the high points of the design, and so you'll see that they remain white and the watercolor kind of settles around them, which gives you a really fun look on these flowers in the end. So I'll paint each one of these centers. These are kind of easy to miss when you're starting out, so go back and fill in any little flowers that you missed, and that's just the beginning. And we want this watercolor to run together. That's why I sprayed the back, it's why I sprayed the front, and it's why I'm working on glass, because that helps keep the paper wet for the duration of this exercise. If any of it dries, then your color will kind of grab, and that actually happens to me here on this first part, but don't worry about it because we're going to fix it. I just didn't spray the top part of the paper the way I sprayed the rest, as you can see by the difference in color as I'm adding this same olive green down below. But it's okay because I can just add water to that area and sort of thin it out while that paper is still wet. And I'll go back and add some darker pieces to sort of match that piece as well later on. But this is all going to be colored in and you're not going to notice this at all. So I'll fill in around all of the leaves with this olive green. And that color on the left that looks like a second green is actually yellow. And so I'm adding a little bit of that to the flower centers as well for a little pop of color. It'll sort of blend with the kind of corally red that I chose for the center, but it really adds something to sort of warm that color up. I just love mixing watercolor on the paper. I think you get such interesting colors that way. So go in and fill around the edges of these little dogwood looking flowers. I have a dogwood tree in my yard. It's my favorite tree. I do play favorites with my trees. It's just a reality. Now the last color I'll put on is going to be this blue color. So it'll sort of give the illusion of sky in the background. And I'll come back and balance out like the darker green part at the top. But in the meantime, I'm going to fill in any remaining unpainted, unembossed space with this blue. And these colors just look so pretty together. I love the way that this ended up. I think as you're painting these, you're probably going to have a few moments where you're like, oh my God, what have I done? Before you get to this stage where you're filling in that background. But once you put that final color down, it all starts to come together. And it sort of looks like a plaster relief type design, which I just love. I love that about 3D embossing folders. And actually, if you look on my channel, you will see several faux plaster techniques and several variations of those techniques. I have repeated this sort of plaster look many times on my channel using a different number of steps, different kinds of steps, different mediums, just because it's one of my favorite looks. So down here at the bottom, I'm just going down to where the embossing stops. And then I'm coming back in after I end up with the blue to put that balancing dark green down in the lower right to balance that darker green up at the top left. So that's just one little trick for if you're a little out of balance with your color because your paper's dry, just balance it out on the other side of your card and it will be just fine. So now you will want to dry this all the way. We do have one more final step, but you'll want to get this watercolor paper good and dry before we move to that step because wet paper can be vulnerable paper, even cold pressed watercolor paper. And you'll want it completely dry. So now you can see those nice bright white spots of those flowers emerging from the darker background that has the watercolor on it. It's so pretty. And then you'll just take a rag that is dipped in water and you'll remove any additional watercolor from the top of the embossed part just to make that pop even more and really, really stand out from the background. This is such a beautiful look, especially for this floral folder. Be sure and check out the other video in this series for more tips on easy highlighting your embossing folders. Head over to my blog for more information, and thanks so much for watching.